And welcome back to the HDR Masterclass. In this continuation segment, we're going to continue to discuss the tone mapping with Photomatix Pro. Now, in the previous segment, in discussing Photomatix Pro, I had talked about setting the white point and setting the black point, and then I promised you that we would move on and talk about things like strength. So here we are. We're now at the point where we're going to be addressing strength. Now, do keep in mind that these are my particular adjustment sequences. Everybody will have their own, your own particular preferred approach and your own particular preferred sequence, and that's fine. That's fine. It really is best if everybody just decides where they want to go, in what order, and sometimes it has a lot to do with the image that you're working with. This image here is particularly tough. It is, it has, and this is by design for purposes of training. It has very intense highlights. It has shadows. It has a lot of dark areas and some bright areas. This is high detail area here, high detail area in this area as well. And so I wanted this particular scenario to be a challenging HDR scenario. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to address the strength. Now, the strength adjustment will enhance the contrast and the detail globally throughout the image. Let's just take this and pull it all the way down and see what happens to our image. So you'll notice here that my strength adjustment all the way to the minimum, a value of 0, has really thrown off the tones within the image. You'll note now, if you always keep an eye on this histogram as I twiddle the knobs here, and you'll get a real sense for the intensity and the distributions of the tones throughout the image. You'll notice here that I have backed way away. My tones have been shifted. My highlights, the highlights in this area, have been shifted towards the shadow side. All right, and the distribution of my tones has been spread out considerably throughout the image. This has the effect of brightening the entire image. All right, now let's go back to the default. If you double click in Photomatix Pro, if you double click on a slider, double click, then it will set it back to the factory default position, in this case the value of 70. All right, now you see what happened to my tones. They shifted more back towards the low side. These are the mid-tones have been shifted more towards the shadow. And that's a good thing for me, because this particular image does have, by design, all right, because I set this scene up so that I could have heavy shadows on the interiors and very bright highlights. So this is actually a good thing for me to have the tones shifted more towards the shadows. Let's just take that strength slider and yank it all the way up there. Now you see what happened to my tones is that they shifted even more toward the shadow side. But now this is too dark. Let me just call up the loop here. It's pretty dark in there. And I'm really losing detail within this shadowed area. And you'll also notice here that I've lost a lot of detail in this background, which is a hanging black cloth. So 100 is just certainly too much strength. I'm going to double click that, put it back to 70. I like that. It turns out I happen to like that particular default setting. All right, now Next thing I like to do is I like to turn my attention to gamma. You'll notice here that I'm not following a top-down. I'm really I'm working with the adjustments that will give me a good distribution of my highlights and my shadows. So now let's work with the gamma a little bit. Now what the gamma does is it brightens. If I move to the right, if I move the slider to the right, it will brighten the highlights. And whoa, that doesn't look good at all. So if I was to move it to the left, it is going to darken the midtones. You see what happened to my histogram, the distribution of my tones? They went more towards the shadow side, more towards the dark. And I have very serious clipping now. As you can note in this area, I've virtually lost all my detail. So gamma will work with the midtones. I'm going to double click that and put it back to the default. Now, but I do want to adjust the gamma a little bit because I do want some of the midtones to be darkened a little bit. So I'm going to just tweak that down one step. Well, that looks pretty good. I haven't lost all my details in my shadow area. All right. So I'm going to leave gamma right there. The next thing I do is I take a look at temperature. And the temperature is pretty handy adjustment. Basically, it will adjust all of the colors of the RGB channels, red, green, blue, simultaneously. For purposes of understanding what it does, well, basically, if you were to move the temperature dial upward, what it does is it warms the image. And you'll note, let me put it back to default, and if you watch the image, see what it does. All right, it warmed the scene. Now, put it back to default. I want you now to watch the histogram. Let's move the histogram over to here. Now watch the histogram. When I turn this, I'm going to all the way up here just to really, you notice how the distribution on the intensity of my tones didn't really change. The color changed. All right, now we could take a few minutes here and we could look at the red, green, and blue histograms, but that's and see what the impact is. But that's a little bit more detailed than I wanted to get in this particular demonstration. So I'm going to set that back to my default position. Get that back to default. All right, and I'll just put it. Okay. I'm going to, now if I moved it to the left here, I'm going to introduce a cooler color, colder. Now I'll tell you, I'm just liking its default position. I'm going to stay with this. All right. So that's the next thing I do. Now, the next thing I do, this is my personal preference in the order that I address these controls. I like to take a look at tone compression right here. All right. Now you'll notice here that this image is not where I want it to be. I'm not done yet. I'm experimenting, controlling. I'm making adjustments. One adjustment that I make may have an impact on another setting that I had made a few minutes earlier. What I'm trying to do here is to settle this down. Keeping in mind that my objective here is I want this to be a realistic scene. I want to preserve details in the shadows, and I want to preserve details in the highlights. I want this to be a realistic scene. So now, tone compression. So tone compression is going to adjust the dynamic range across the entire image. All of these settings that I've talked about so far have a global effect. That is, they have an effect on the entire image at all pixels. Let me take this tonal compression, and yank it all the way over to the right. And you see what happens here. And watch that histogram. Let's put it back to its default. All right. Now I'm going to put it all the way to the left. That is the, well, that's the minimum. That's the -10. And you see what happened here. The intensity and the distribution of the tones was radically altered. And basically, my tone distribution has been spread out. And I have moved away from having an optimum highlight. And so therefore, I've tended to brighten the image. And obviously, this isn't going to work for me. If I just click on that loop there, you know, I still have, those are readable very close up, but not from a distance. So let's go back to tone compression. Let's put this back to where it was. Now, so if you remember, if I yanked it all the way to the right, all right, I tend to move the distribution of my tones towards the shadow, and I move away from having an optimum highlight. So tone compression is just not going to work for me in this particular scene. However, I do want to tweak it down a little bit, and I'm watching the histogram. Yeah, that's probably right where I want to be. That's about the best I think I can do with the tone compression at this time. All right, the next thing I like to do is look at color saturation. Now, you'll notice that the color saturation is, well, it's pretty heavy right here. And I'll just take the loop and come over here. That's pretty heavy. I think it's the color saturation is a little bit too much. I'm going to just go, well, if I take it all the way down here, I deplete all of the colors within the scene. So I don't, let me go back to default. I'm going to just cut this back a little bit. I want to try to get those colors, especially the color, that's nice, okay. We have a darker red in this area here. This is not a gaudy red anymore. The yellows have been softened so that they're looking more like wood. All right, so I'm going to actually take that color saturation down a tad more. Okay, that's even better. So I'm liking that. So I've actually reduced the color saturation, giving this scene a more normal look. All right. Then what I do is I turn my attention to lighting adjustments. This is more of a kind of a look and a feel type of adjustment. Let me just take it and crank it all the way up there. And not a whole lot happened to the scene here. Take it all the way back down. Okay. So now the lighting adjustments has given this this scene here kind of an interesting look. It's actually emphasized the lighting or the highlights in this darker area here. You'll notice here. Let me just put that back to our default. You see what's happened? All right, I'm going to crank that all the way down again, just so we can see what we're doing. And we're looking at this now. I'll crank it all the way to the right to the maximum value. All right, so you can see here that this is actually modifying the contrast within the scene in terms of lighting. I don't want the background drape here to be accentuated like this, because this background drape here is not the point of the image. So I am not going to do something like this that's enhancing the background drape. I actually want that background drape to actually be somewhat reduced in its visual prominence in the scene. So I'm going to go with the lighting adjustment right there. Okay, now micro smoothing. Let's turn our attention to these advanced options here. Now, micro smoothing will actually adjust the enhancement of details. Now, I've called up this loop here on these detailed areas here, and that's what we got. Now let's take this micro smoothing and let's yank it all the way up and watch what happens in that loop. All right, all the way to the maximum there. It basically, micro smoothing has an effect of giving a cleaner look. And by cleaner, let's go down to micro smoothing all the way to the right there. A little bit cleaner, a little bit crisper. The edges are more well defined. Again, I'll go all the way to the maximum. Watch this area right here. See how it kind of blurred out? So micro smoothing is nice to be able to enhance detail. I'm going to go all the way back down here. And actually the detail is a bit more enhanced when I have the micro smoothing all the way down to the minimum. Now I double clicked on that again and I went back to the default, and this is the default of my default preset. So I actually like this. I really don't feel I can improve upon the micro smoothing setting for this particular scene. I'm going to leave it at its default position. All right, now the next thing I go for, now again, you know, this is just my preference, and it's not always this particular sequence in my adjustments that I address, but for this particular scene, there are certain things I need to do. I need to preserve the highlights, I need to preserve the detail, the shadows, and I want to enhance detail because there's a lot of detail in this scene. Next thing I'm going to do then is take a look at the saturation of the highlights. Now I'm just going to take that setting and I'm going to crank her way up there just to give you an idea what happens when you adjust this particular slider. And what it did is it saturated the highlights. And this is a highlight, this is a highlight, that's a highlight. These are shadows, and that could be considered a shadow as well. So what I did is I saturated the highlights. Now I'm just going to slide all the way down there. Now you'll notice here that anywhere where there's a highlight, where the tonal values are in the high tone area, I've actually desaturated the highlights. What's really nice about Photomatix Pro, and this is true with many software applications, is that you can actually control the attributes of various tone segments. I'm going to put that back to normal, and I do indeed want to desaturate in the highlights, but only by a little bit. All right, so let's go right here. That's good. That's good. It kind of softened the colors, the color tones on the highlights area. This is returning more of a natural wood. So this is good. Okay. Next thing I do is I take a look at the saturation of the shadows right here. Again, let's crank that all the way up. Oh, look what happened here. You see, I've actually oversaturated the colors, the RGB, red, green, blue colors of anything that was in the shadow area. All right, this is all kind of your dark, your low tones, and all that got oversaturated, all out here, and obviously that's not what I want. I'm going to put the saturation of the shadows back to the default, and for purposes of demonstration, I'm just going to crank it all the way down to the minimum. I have like virtually no colors now. Basically, I've went grayscale in all of the low-toned areas. So I'm going to put that back to its default, and I really don't see, well, maybe I could bring that up a little bit to kind of richen the wood, all right, in the shadow area. So that's where I like that. All right, so we're going to take a break here and end this particular segment. And when we return for our third and final segment of this tone mapping demonstration using Photomatix Pro, I'm going to be talking about the few remaining adjustments that we can do on this particular image, and then we'll move into applying the tone mapping, doing the finishing touches, and saving out the image so that we can continue working with this tone mapped image. So please join me in the next segment where we'll wrap up this demonstration with Photomatix Pro, and I think you'll find that quite interesting. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you in a few minutes.